Have you ever imagined being controlled by someone so powerful that they seem to dictate every step of your life? Now, imagine discovering that under this pressure, you are able to change not only your destiny, but also that of everyone around you. Today, we're going to dive into the story of Luis, a young man who struggles to break free from the clutches of a domineering mother and find his true identity in a world where every choice can be a battle. Before we start, if you're not already subscribed to the channel, hit the subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss any of our exciting stories. And if you like this video, leave your like and comment below your impressions. Now, let's find out how Luis faces the biggest challenge of his life. Madalena Menezes has always made a point of reminding the world, and especially her own son, Luis Menezes, of the weight of belonging to such an influential family. From this weight was born the pressure to live up to the relentless expectations that she herself had helped to build. Luis had never known what freedom really was. From a very young age, he realized that his mother was around to shape each of his choices. Magdalene was a woman of imposing presence, a born leader, whose eyes seemed to see the most hidden intentions of anyone who crossed her path. He never took no for an answer. In Luis's eyes, she was almost a deity, controlling the environment around her with an invisible but impossible to ignore force. From an early age, Madalena made sure that her son would strictly follow in the footsteps she traced. Because Luis was not just a boy growing up in a wealthy family. He represented the future of the Menezes empire, the heir destined to carry on the legacy built with difficulty by his ancestors. However, Madalena and Luis had contrasting personalities. While she fed on voracious ambition, relentless lust for power, and appreciation for perfection, Luis lacked this thirst for dominance. The mornings at the Menezes mansion mirrored exactly the kind of life Luis led. Everything had an appointment, starting with an impeccably served coffee at 7 o'clock. The breakfast table followed an unshakable pattern. Cutlery arranged in symmetrical lines, fine crockery chosen under strict aesthetic criteria, and a cafe whose temperature was measured so as not to deviate 1 degree from what Madalena considered appropriate. As soon as Luis descended the majestic staircase to the dining room, he found his mother already seated, impeccable in a sober dress, without a hair out of place. The disapproving look she used to cast was almost inevitable, as if she was always trying to find a detail to be corrected, whether it was the knot of Luis's tie or a simple disarray in his suit. "Luis, I spoke 1,000 times about maintaining my impeccable posture, especially on special days like today," said Madalena, her voice firm, denoting that she would not admit contestation. He, already used to it, merely nodded and adjusted whatever was necessary: the tie, the lapel, the hair, anything that was out of the script. Luis had long understood that arguing with Madalena was useless. She was the kind of person who always felt she was right, and any flaw, no matter how small, was an insult to the name Menezes. Despite his obedient countenance, Luis felt the constant pressure weigh on him like an invisible anchor. Over the years, he became an increasingly superficial version of himself, a boy who lived solely to please his mother. This suffocating dynamic was reflected in every decision he made, or rather that his mother made for him. Luis's routine was taken up by incessant commitments scheduled by Madalena. She chose his clothes, set his schedules, and decided who Luis should or should not have a relationship with, keeping everything strictly under control. If he had to attend a business lunch, she would approve in advance the dish he would order. If he was forced to represent the family at some social event, she rehearsed every sentence he should say. If Luis tried to imagine a different life, these thoughts appeared as brief fantasies, from which he was promptly pulled back to reality by Madalena's rigid voice. Luis's place was not to decide anything for himself, but to obey her. The maximum tension occurred when Luis turned 22. As a gift, Madalena officially placed him as vice president of Menezes Corp., the company that managed much of the family business. Luis was expected to take that position, but he received the news with mixed feelings. There was pride, but also a presentiment that it would be just another way for his mother to exert absolute control over his steps. On his first day as vice president, Luis entered the sumptuous office with a lump in his throat. Everyone was attentive to his arrival, hoping that he would be the leader that Magdalene announced so much. but he felt more like an actor fulfilling the main role in a play whose lines he had not written. As if her own inexperience were not enough, Madalena made a point of supervising everything. Every project, every contract, every proposal went through her scrutiny. She analyzed every detail, imposed her opinions, and rarely left room for her son's voice. There was even a specific meeting room at Menezes Corp that Louise tried at all costs to avoid. A large, sophisticated space with floor-to-ceiling windows, and for him that environment turned into a den of suffocation whenever Madalena appeared. It was there that she sat to the right of her son during meetings with investors and representatives of various sectors. Instead of being a counselor or assistant, she acted as the highest authority, overseeing every word. Louise even felt the air get heavier whenever she was present, as if there was a lack of oxygen. He understood the importance of maintaining the legacy. He did not devalue the commitment of his ancestors or the dedication of Madalena. But over time, he increasingly recognized that there was no room for error. And with no room for error, there was no room to learn or discover one's own identity. When representing the company at social events, the pressure multiplied. Madalena always repeated that the image was everything, and a slip in front of the eyes of high society could be costly. Louise went, smiled, acted, but all that sounded empty. He knew that the man who hid behind expensive suits and memorized speeches had no idea who he really was. At a certain point, Louise began to feel that he lived in an automatic mode. When she looked in the mirror, she no longer recognized herself. Maternal control began to cause him anxiety in a way that he himself did not quite understand, but that corroded his tranquility inside. That morning, especially, Louise woke up with an uncomfortable feeling. Her heart was beating fast, anticipating a crucial event that was to come, the meeting with the main investors of Menezes Corp. Madalena had dedicated weeks to planning every second of this meeting, because it was there that Louise would finally consolidate, in her eyes, as the ideal successor. She got up before dawn, reviewed Louise's written speech, and not at all authorial, made detailed notes, and left everything printed on the breakfast table. Every word had been strategically chosen, every pause rehearsed. For Madalena, Louise just needed to follow the script to the letter. During the drive to the company, Madalena punctually repeated the statistics he should cite, the promises he would have to make to win over investors. He spoke with unshakable conviction, as if victory was guaranteed, as long as Louise did not dare to improvise. He just listened, feeling the knot in his tie tighten his neck like a handcuff. When they arrived at the huge Menezes Corp building, Louise had the impression that it was even bigger and more oppressive than he had ever noticed. Every step he took echoed in the marble corridors. The respectful greetings of the employees passed by him. He couldn't shake the feeling that a storm was coming, not just in the business world, but inside his own chest. The meeting room was bright, with a very long dark wood table and elegantly aligned leather chairs. Through the large windows, natural light poured in, but that day it seemed almost aggressive. When Louise entered, everyone was already there, including the main investors. Magdalene stood to his right, emanating an aura of authority that was intimidating. Then Louise began to speak, following the text printed in his hands. But as the meeting progressed, that feeling of suffocation washed over him. The memorized phrases came out emotionless, mechanical. Investors listened attentively, some jotting down details, others exchanging glances of evaluation. At a certain point, Louise stopped. He was silent for a few seconds that seemed like an eternity. His eyes went to Magdalene, who wore an expression of bewilderment mixed with disapproval. He knew he was about to cross a line that his mother would never approve of, but he felt unable to keep repeating words that did not represent what he really thought. Taking a deep breath, he finally broke the silence. "Gentlemen, I know that everyone expects from me the classic speeches, the promises that appear in the reports and projections that we usually present. But today I need to be honest. If we want to continue growing sustainably, we need to change." The reaction of those present ranged from surprise to curiosity. Some leaned back in their chairs, attentive. Others furrowed their brows. Madalena, static, kept her countenance imperturbable, although Louise knew that, inside, she must be seething with fury. We need to stop repeating old models just because they worked in other times. The world scenario is constantly evolving. and companies that do not adapt are left behind. Menezes Corp cannot afford this luxury. We need more innovative investments, alliances that consider not only profit, but sustainability and socio-environmental responsibility. Some investors began to exchange puzzled looks, while one or the other was surprised by Luis's sincerity. He continued, now lulled by the courage he had found within himself. No more empty speeches. It is time to put into practice everything that theory says we should do. Our customers, partners, and competitors are moving. We need to take the lead on greener and more socially responsible solutions. This is not idealism, but a matter of business survival. When he finally concluded his unplanned speech, the room remained silent for a moment. Luis felt his heart racing. I had no idea how they would react. Finally, one of the oldest investors, who used to be Madalena's ally, took the floor. I confess that I didn't expect to hear that today, Luis. But I appreciate the frankness. We cannot deny that the market is changing rapidly. Perhaps it is time to review some traditional practices. Other investors nodded, some with comments in support of the new vision, others asking for details of how they could implement such changes. The meeting was reconfigured, and Luis, who had started out unsure, started to lead the conversation. That renewed his breath and, for the first time, gave him the feeling that he was there in his own right. Magdalene remained silent. On the outside, she kept the pose, but inside, Luis knew that she interpreted every word as an affront. Despite everything, she did not intervene. Perhaps part of her recognized that her son was no longer the submissive boy he once was. At the end, exhausted but relieved, Luis stood up. There was an awareness that she would have to face the consequences, especially with regard to her relationship with her mother. However, nothing took away the feeling of finally having spoken his own truth. Magdalene left the room without looking back, heading for the elevator. A whirlwind of ideas and emotions certainly ran through his mind. Luis, for now, chose to allow himself a few moments of personal satisfaction. He had come head-to-head with the greatest symbol of control in his life, and he had lived to tell it. Yukina Varanen that same afternoon, feeling suffocated by the demands and still processing the courage he had had in the meeting, Luis felt a visceral need to escape from that corporate universe and the expectations that weighed on him. He wanted to find out what it was like to simply exist without thinking about business, appearance, or last name. He decided to walk aimlessly through the crowded streets of the city, where people seemed to go about their routines without caring about the presence of a young heir to one of the richest families. Hurried workers, students talking animatedly, couples holding hands, all leading their lives without the rigidity to which Luis was accustomed. Without realizing it, he ended up in a neighborhood of old buildings and narrower streets. The rhythm there was different, and that attracted him. There was a simplicity in the way the stores lined the sidewalks, how people talked in front of the houses, something that contrasted radically with the opulence of the mansion and the office. Following a scent of fresh coffee, Luis arrived at a small corner establishment, a modest cafe restaurant. The glass door had a bell that rang softly when he entered. It was a cozy place with few tables and simple but cozy decor. The smell of baking cake and freshly brewed coffee made Luis immediately feel an unprecedented tranquility. He sat by the window, from where he could observe the street. For a moment, he forgot any obligation. At that moment, Renata appeared, a young woman whose gentle smile brought a serene atmosphere. She seemed to belong there. He moved with the naturalness of someone who really enjoys what he does. "Good afternoon." "Do you already know what you want?" she asked, her voice soft without a forced tone, something very different from what Luis was used to hearing in his social circle. He looked at her, still stunned by the emotions of the day. "I'm not sure. Any suggestions?" Renata smiled, understanding. "We have an apple pie that is a specialty of the house. It can be accompanied by coffee or tea. I recommend the coffee." "Perfect. I'll keep the apple pie and coffee then," Luis replied, letting the tension dissipate a little. As Renata walked away, he realized how comfortable he felt there. There was something in the way she spoke, in the kindness that transpired, that aroused her curiosity. He, who had spent his life surrounded by calculating and cold people, was captivated by that simple aura. When Renata returned with the pie and coffee, A comfortable silence took over the table for a few seconds. Louise observed the tranquility with which she arranged the dishes. He tried the pie, discovering a flavor that seemed surprisingly homemade. "You're not from here, are you?" she ventured without seeming invasive. "Generally, I recognize everyone who shows up here." Louise smiled, finding amused in the direct way she spoke. "Not really. I live in another part of the city, but I needed to go for a walk today. Feeling the outdoors, you know?" Renata nodded, showing understanding in her eyes. And the simple fact that she didn't insist on asking about details of his life, about his family or anything like that, made Louise feel a pang of gratitude. The people she used to deal with were invariably driven by interest, and Renata seemed genuinely devoid of that kind of malice. "I see. Sometimes we just need to get out of our place a little to find a different peace. I'm glad you found something of that here," she said. Louise finished eating in silence, just absorbing the low conversations around and the simple movement of the restaurant. When Renata brought the bill, he found himself wondering if there was any way to prolong that feeling of normality. "Thank you for your service, Renata. Everything was delicious. This place, there's something special here," Louise commented as he stood up, deciding not to force the bar anymore. "I'm glad you liked it. I hope he comes back." "You will always be welcome," she replied, smiling. Already on the street, walking slowly, Louise realized that he felt lighter, as if an immense weight had been temporarily lifted from his shoulders. Still, he couldn't help but think about how Renata had marked him. The humility of that young woman was something so rare in her daily life that it became almost magnetic. No doubt she was a far cry from the standard of people he usually lived with, but that was precisely what fascinated him. Seimer, as a few days later, still lulled by the memory of the meeting with Renata, Louis found himself facing a dilemma. He needed to tell Madalena that he had met someone outside his elitist circle. She knew it would be a bomb because she couldn't wait for her mother to react with open arms. Even so, he was determined not to hide anything. That night, when he went down to dinner, he felt a tightness in his stomach. The mansion was silent, lit by chandeliers that highlighted works of art and sumptuous decorative pieces. Everything was carefully chosen by Madalena, who valued the minute details of her appearance. She was waiting for him at the table, impeccable in his bearing as usual. After a brief greeting, Louise went straight to the point. "Mom, I met someone. A person unlike anything we are used to. I wanted you to know." Magdalene looked up, putting aside the glass of wine she was holding. That piercing gaze brought an apparent calm, but Louise knew enough to know that she processed every word with caution. Who would be such a different person? "Her name is Renata. She works in a restaurant in a neighborhood further away from the center. It is simple but very true, and I'm being honest when I say that I liked her. I felt a connection that I never had with other people," Louise explained, choosing his words carefully. Magdalene listened to everything in silence, but her expression closed. Finally, he replied, "Louise, you know the responsibilities you have. Being part of the Menezes family means caring for an image, for a status that is not only yours, but of all of us. I'm not going to pretend that I approve of the idea of you getting involved with someone who doesn't understand or don't know our world." That bothered him. "Mom, I'm not asking you to agree. I just wanted you to understand. Not everyone needs to be born in a golden cradle to have value." She shook her head, keeping her tone of voice calm but authoritative. "I didn't say it's worthless. I just said that maybe it's not suitable for our reality. You're still young, and as much as you think she's amazing, there are risks of involvement that can damage the image we've built." Anger grew inside Louis, but he tried to maintain his serenity. "Who said damaging the image? I'm not asking for approval for a business, Mom. I'm talking about a person who, it makes me feel good in a way I've never felt." Magdalene, with an almost theatrical gesture, dropped her napkin on the table and stood up. "Louise, think carefully about what you are doing. It is not a simple novel. Our family carries a history, and you can't put everything to waste for a fleeting desire." Without waiting for an answer, she left the room. Louise stood there, alone, feeling a mixture of frustration, guilt, and also a growing rebellion. He was exhausted from living a life in which every step was dictated by his mother. At the same time, Renata continued with her routine in the small restaurant. But since the meeting with Louise, she began to imagine him in the midst of the simple daily life she knew. I felt a mixture of curiosity and fear. He was clearly out of this world, a world that was too wealthy and complex. Still, Louise's respectful manner had captivated her. To Renata's surprise, he returned to the restaurant a few times, increasingly comfortable in starting a conversation. Between laughter and subtle confessions, she got to know the boy behind the expensive suit, discovering that there was someone there full of anxieties and insecurities, and, naturally, a sincere feeling began to blossom. Louise soon realized that he could not keep it a secret for long. He needed to go a step further and invite Renata to visit his house, even though he knew the explosive potential of such an attitude. And so he did, with some hesitation but determination. "I'd like you to come to my house for dinner. I know it's a formal environment, but I want my mother to meet you," Louise proposed one afternoon while they were talking at one of the cafe tables, after busy hours. Renata frowned, feeling butterflies in her stomach. "Are you sure? I don't want to get in the way of anything. It's not a matter of getting in the way. I want you to be a real part of my life. I don't want to hide or pretend that I don't feel what I feel anymore." Despite the nervousness, Renata accepted the invitation. She knew it would be a challenge, but also that otherwise she couldn't continue moving forward in the relationship. On the night of the dinner, the Menezes mansion was prepared. Magdalene, still upset, maintained her usual elegance. There was an icy flash in her eyes, and Louise sensed that his mother had something in mind to make Renata's life difficult. But it was too late to turn back. Renata arrived minutes before the agreed time, wearing a simple but tasteful outfit. He carried a slightly nervous smile, for he had never been in such a luxurious place. Upon seeing her, Louise smiled in welcome, trying to convey confidence. Magdalene was waiting for her in the main hall. Dressed in a sober designer set, she greeted Renata with a calculated handshake. "Welcome, Renata. The house is yours." The polite way Maddalena spoke did not hide a cutting subtext, but Renata maintained her posture, aware that she was being evaluated every second. They went to the dining room, where the table was set with extreme refinement. Silver cutlery, crystal glasses, rare flowers in the center. An atmosphere that did not match Renata's life at all, but she tried to stand firm. During dinner, the content of the conversation was kept in superficial subjects. Maddalena, always polite, asked questions that seemed harmless, but sounded like subtle traps to highlight the differences between Renata and that reality. "So, Renata, Louise told me that you work in a restaurant. What is your daily life like there?" Magdalene questioned, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I help with the service. Sometimes I also take care of part of the kitchen when there are no people," replied Renata, trying to appear calm. Magdalene gave a small smile, almost a smile of triumph. "I imagine it is very different from what we do here at Menezes Corp. The corporate demands are intense. They require specific training." Renata nodded slightly. "Without a doubt, it is very different. But I think that each type of work has its value. In the restaurant, I learned to deal with people of all kinds, and that taught me a lot." Luis watched everything, almost unable to intervene. He was astonished by the way his mother manipulated the conversation, but at the same time he admired Renata's composure, who did not lose her temper or show insecurity. At one point, Magdalene ordered them to open a bottle of very expensive wine, a foreign label famous for the complexity of its aromas. He poured everyone's glasses, describing the nuances of the wine and the correct way to taste it, as if he were conducting a test. Renata, without having extensive knowledge about fine wines, took a small sip, but did not show any astonishment or slip. "I just said, it's unlike any wine I've ever tasted. It has a strong but interesting flavor." Magdalene frowned, not satisfied with not extracting any comment that would betray ignorance from the guest. In turn, Renata remained firm, without allowing the discomfort to grow. At the end of dinner, when Renata said goodbye, Luis accompanied her to the door. He was disappointed with his mother's attitude, but he was also proud of how Renata had done in the face of hostility. "I know it wasn't the warmest welcome in the world," Luis commented, holding Renata's hand for a few seconds. "I understand. I just hope that someday we can really get to know each other without so many barriers, she replied before leaving. At that moment, Luis realized that the battle to maintain that relationship would be arduous. Madalena would not give a truce, and Renata, as strong as she was, did not deserve to go through constant humiliation. Even so, he was determined to fight. When he returned to the hall, he found Magdalene alone, staring at the fireplace. The conversation that followed was short and tense. "You were too harsh, Mom. She didn't deserve this," Luis shot bluntly. "I did what I thought necessary to show her the place she occupies. If you can't even stand this kind of situation, how could you handle the real pressure of our world?" Magdalene replied, her voice dry. Luis almost screamed, but restrained himself. He just turned his back and went up to the room, determined not to give up on Renata. From then on, he knew that he had to prepare himself to face all forms of control and manipulation that his mother could throw at him. Shortly after, the date of Luis's birthday arrived. Traditionally, Madalena organized grandiose parties to celebrate her only son, who was also the youngest and most promising face of the family business. This year would be no different. The mansion gained exuberant lighting, worthy of great receptions. Outdoor chandeliers, ambient music, luxury cars parked in the courtyard. Luis, however, did not find courage. He knew that, behind the glow, there was an emptiness that would not leave him alone. Even so, he complied with protocol, receiving guests, executives, businessmen, politicians, and personalities from high society, all within the script planned by Madalena. Renata would arrive later because Luis had insisted that she should participate, like anyone close to him, without being intimidated by the pomp. However, unbeknownst to him, Magdalene had taken malicious action. He had ordered Renata, through a messenger, to be given a dress supposedly chosen for the occasion. The cruel detail: the model was almost identical to the dress uniform worn by the employees of his house. When Renata entered the room, it didn't take long to attract confused looks. Some people, not knowing who she was, mistook her for catering. An elderly lady, known for her arrogance and closeness to Madalena, even held out an empty glass towards Renata. "Could you bring me more champagne, please?" Hearing that, Renata felt her face blush instantly. The humiliation paralyzed her for a moment. She noticed, at a glance, other guests looking at her strangely. Why was she dressed like the service personnel? She had no idea of Madalena's plot. Luis, who was talking to a group of colleagues, saw the scene from afar. A wave of despair took hold of him. He tried to get closer but was surrounded by people who wanted to congratulate him, not understanding the urgency in his eyes. Renata, in turn, managed to babble something inaudible and slip away, feeling her chest tightened. He walked through the corridors until he found an empty corner near the exit, trying to compose himself. However, the tears were already beginning to flow. As soon as Luis managed to free himself, he ran to her. He found her with her face marked by shame and disappointment. "Renata, I'm sorry. I had no idea that my mother would send that dress. I never wanted you to go through this," he said, his voice trembling with guilt. Renata tried to remain dignified, but the sadness was evident. "I know you didn't do it on purpose, Luis, but I can't pretend it's okay. People here look at me as if I were a strange being. Don't you see how hard it is for me?" He hugged her, not caring about the looks of others. "I do, yes. And I'm sorry. Please stay. I don't want this night to end like this." She shook her head, swallowing the lump in her throat. "I can't, Luis. I need some time to think. I don't know if I can fit into this world of yours so full of traps." Luis, with a heavy heart, ended up giving in. "I knew that Renata needed space." "I see. I just want you to know that you are more important to me than this whole scenario. Don't forget that." Renata made a slight wave. "I'll try to remember, but I need to go now." She left, leaving Luis standing, feeling miserable. While inside the mansion, the party continued with music and laughter. She realized at that moment that there was no sense in all that luxury if she couldn't share it with those who really cared. Magdalene, watching from afar, smiled out of the corner of her mouth. For her, this confirmed her expectations. Renata would never fit in. Luis, in turn, began to feel the urge to definitively break with everything that his mother represented, but I didn't know how yet. The days that followed were painful emptiness for Luis, and not much better for Renata. They stopped talking to each other for a while. She needed to reflect on whether it would be worth fighting for someone who belonged to a world so far away from hers. He, in turn, was consumed with the guilt of having exposed her to Magdalene's cruelty. Magdalene, satisfied, believed that the threat had been neutralized. He spoke little about the subject, maintaining an air of victory. For her, it was a relief to see that her son had returned to behave more silently, without mentioning the humble girl. However, life is full of twists and turns, and soon, fate would show everyone there that its flow is independent of wills and controls. Renata, one afternoon, received an unexpected call from a renowned law firm. The voice on the other end identified herself as Dr. Helio, representing a client who wanted to meet her urgently to deal with family matters. At first, she was suspicious, as she had no contact with any distant relatives, especially those with possessions. But the lawyer assured that it was something serious and asked her to appear at the office the next day. Arriving at the site, he came across a modern building with mirrored windows and a refined atmosphere. She was ushered into a meeting room where she found a middle-aged man with an austere look but a surprisingly friendly tone of voice. "Renata, nice to meet you. My name is Helio Noguera, Mr. Adriano Esteves' lawyer," the man announced, extending his hand. "Nice to meet you. But who is this gentleman?" she asked, confused. Helio paused slightly, as if preparing the ground for an impactful piece of news. "He's your grandfather, and he is the owner of Energia Esteves, one of the largest sustainable energy companies in the country." The statement left Renata astonished. She had always heard from her mother that her grandfather had passed away before his birth. How could he be alive? And even more so being the owner of such a large company. "But how is this possible? My mother never said anything." Renata's voice cracked, a mixture of curiosity and indignation. "Your grandfather has a long and complex history with your family. There have been many problems in the past, but when he found out that you existed, he decided not to waste any more time and wants to meet you immediately. He also asked me to tell her that you are his only heir," the lawyer revealed, smiling in order to reassure her. Renata felt as if the world was turning. As if it wasn't enough to find out that her grandfather was alive, now the information emerged that she would inherit a gigantic renewable energy company. It was a lot to take in at once. After taking a deep breath and reflecting, she agreed to meet him. The next day, in a private meeting, he met Adriano Esteves. He had a distinguished air, but with an expression of restrained tenderness. She explained that, for reasons she preferred to tell calmly, she had moved away from her daughter and lost contact. However, when he learned about Renata, he no longer wanted to postpone the approach. He invited her to take on a prominent role at Energia Esteves, especially because he believed that the new generations needed to bring a renewed look to the company. Renata, without ground, was faced with the proposal to, in the future, become the CEO of one of the most competitive enterprises in the sector. At first, she refused, scared, but Adriano convinced her that she deserved to know up close what could be the future of her family. Thus, a quick and impressive process of immersion in the corporate world began. Renata took management classes, meetings with executives, and began to attend events she had never imagined going to. Shortly after, an announcement shook the market. Renata had officially become the executive director in transition to CEO of Energia Esteves. The news made headlines in newspapers and economic websites, taking everyone by surprise, including Madalena and Luis. One morning, while Luis was having breakfast at the mansion, Madalena entered the living room with an expression of complete astonishment, holding a newspaper. "Look at this, Renata. That girl is the new leader of Energia Esteves." Luis, who had already had informal news on the subject, confirmed it with a nod. Yes, it seems that she was the granddaughter of Mr. Adriano Esteves. Magdalene could not hide her indignation and surprise. She had always seen Renata as any waitress. He had never dreamed that, in a matter of weeks, the girl would occupy a position of rival or equivalent power, something capable of directly affecting even Manisi's corp itself, since the sustainable energy market was an area with great potential for partnerships and competition. "How did that happen?" Magdalene asked, still with a look of shock. Louise took a deep breath, choosing the words. Life is unpredictable, Mom, and I think you're going to have to get used to that idea. Magdalene pursed her lips, aware that she could not act against Renata so openly now. She had become influential, and the image of the Menezes family could be tarnished if she took any hostile action. For Louise, it meant an opportunity to talk to Renata again and try to correct what had gone wrong. He didn't seek her out just because she was powerful now, but because she continued to genuinely care. He admired the strength that Renata had shown in facing such a radical change in her life. When finally Louise and Renata met again, her posture was more confident. The weeks of contact with his grandfather and the corporate universe had given him new security. However, his look still brought some hurt. Louise, a lot has changed, but what I feel for you has not been erased. The question is, how do we deal with the huge differences between our worlds? She was direct. He eagerly replied, If you ask me, it makes no difference whether you're CEO or waitress. I missed you. I know I messed up a lot, but I'm here to fix it, if you let me. Renata sighed, remembering the embarrassment at the party. It wasn't you who messed it up, but the circumstances. However, if we are going to continue, we have to be honest. I'm entering a new game, surrounded by powerful people. I don't want to deal with family intrigues that hurt me. Louise understood, and I'm willing to face whatever it takes. No more letting my mom decide everything. Both realized that this time, they would not be controlled by the whims of others. They knew that Magdalene would not approve easily, but something inside them said that this story could have a different outcome. From then on, Madalena Menezes' world began to reconfigure itself. Seeing Renata rise so quickly forced her to rethink her strategies. This was no longer a simple, humble young woman. She was a leader of a company that could even become a partner or competitor in future projects. At first, Madalena tried to ignore Renata's relevance. But every news story and every mention in business circles made her revive the fear of losing control over her son, and in a way, over the Menezes family's own reputation. As for Luis and Renata, they gradually reconnected. They went out to talk in discreet places, or even exchanged messages to keep in touch. He told about his new steps at Menezes Corp, trying to implement the ideas he had exposed at the investors' meeting. She, in turn, narrated the challenge of entering a market that did not recognize her as an expert, but that, little by little, began to respect her for the firmness of her decisions. Over time, the tension between Madalena and Renata ended up becoming notorious in business environments. There were rumors that Energia Esteves was preparing to launch a revolutionary clean energy project, and that it could become the main supplier of sustainable technologies for several companies, including those of the Menezes Group. Gradually, Madalena realized that, even if she wanted to, she could not eliminate Renata's presence. Worse, in her eyes, Louise did not move away from the young woman, and seemed more and more convinced of following her path. Gradually, a process of reconciliation began to take shape, although no one foresaw it. Madalena, for the first time in her life, was forced to reconsider her role as a mother protector and businesswoman relentless. As much as she didn't want to admit it, she feared losing her son permanently. Luis, aware of the nuances, decided to try a peaceful approach. He had realized that if he did not re-establish harmony with his mother, his relationship with Renata would always be fraught with tensions. I wish they could at least respect each other. On a cloudy Saturday afternoon, Louise found Madalena in the mansion's library, where she used to stay when she wanted to reflect alone. He cleared his throat before speaking. "Mom, can we talk?" She stared at him, closing the book she was reading. There was a tension in the air, but also an evident wear and tear on her countenance, as if she was tired of holding so many internal battles. He asked in a low voice. Louise took a breath. "About me, about you, about Renata, about how things got here." Magdalene put the book down on the table, indicating that it should sit in the opposite armchair. "Go on. I'm listening. I understand that you did everything you thought was best for me, but now things have changed. I'm no longer a child. I want to build my own path. And that includes staying by Renata's side, no matter how much you think she doesn't fit our standard." She frowned slightly. "Louise, everything I did was out of fear. Fear that you weren't ready to deal with a world that can be cruel. Yes, I may have exaggerated, but it was never out of malice. He was surprised by the sincere confession. Then he continued, I understand, but renouncing my feelings is no longer an option. Renata is a strong, hard-working woman, and I am proud of her. And now that she is an important figure, there is no way we can pretend that she does not exist. Magdalene sighed, as if carrying a great weight. I know, and I also realize that she has become someone of influence. Perhaps deep down I respect this force, but accepting all this is not simple for me. Silence reigned for a few moments. Luis let his mother sue. Then he stood up, approaching her armchair. I don't want to lose you, Mom, but I also don't want to lose Renata. Can we try to understand each other? She, looking up, let a hint of emotion escape. Yes, Luis, I don't want to lose my son. And if it is necessary to accept Renata, I accept. But I need time to adapt to it. It was the first time that Madalena showed weakness. Luis realized that this was his chance to effectively create a bridge. Thank you, Mom. I only ask that you talk, without prejudice or ulterior motives. How about a simpler dinner here, on another day, to get together without the pomp of before? She hesitated, but agreed with a slight nod. Let's try. A few days later, the small meeting took place. No major formalities, just Madalena, Luis, and Renata sitting at the table with a homemade menu. The atmosphere was far from being totally relaxed, as there was still a tense history between the two women. But there was room for something new. Dialogue. Renata, now more confident but without ever losing her humility, explained some points about her work at Energia Esteves. He spoke of projects aimed at clean energy, the desire to create partnerships with various companies, including Menezes Corp, if there was openness. Madalena, still a little reticent, ended up being interested in what she said. He recognized that this type of business could mean the future. And above all, he could not deny that Renata exhibited a determination similar to his own. It was almost a mirror of his own willpower, only coming from a completely different place. Luis, attentive, only mediated the conversation when necessary. She felt an immense relief when she realized that both could communicate without exchanging such sharp barbs. I knew it was still too early to talk about friendship, but at least there was respect. Over time, new meetings were scheduled. Madalena, who had never liked to admit faults, began to accept that she had judged Renata with extreme harshness. He did not apologize openly, but his actions showed that at his own pace, he was trying to redeem himself. Renata was not naive either. He remained alert to possible slips or tests by Madalena, but he realized that, little by little, the matriarch Menezes showed signs of trusting in the sincerity of her feelings for Luis. Finally, that process of triple reconciliation, between mother and son, between Luis and Renata, and between Madalena and the young woman, culminated in an intimate dinner without exaggerated luxury, something closer to the real daily life of ordinary people. At the time, even Renata's grandfather, Adriano Esteves, was invited. He and Madalena at first exchanged cautious glances, but maintained the necessary politeness to respect the decision of the youngest. As they raised a toast, Magdalene gave a simple but meaningful speech. May the future allow us to grow, learn, and surprise us. Sometimes life shows us that absolute control is an illusion, and that we need to let go of old prejudices in order to find true happiness. Luis stared at his mother surprised, and then looked at Renata, who smiled slightly. That was more than they expected to hear from a woman who had always made a point of asserting her superiority. For Madalena, each word was a step towards a humility unknown until then. At that moment, it was clear that reconciliation came in an honest way. Madalena would never again be the overprotective and controlling mother she once was. Luis, in turn, finally found the chance to be who he really wanted to be, without having to sacrifice the love he felt for Renata. And for Renata, that acceptance represented not only the realization of being with the person she loved, but proof that the world, even so full of hierarchies and prejudices, could open up to someone who had emerged from simple origins, as long as they had courage and a little luck. Thus, the Menezes family restructured itself. Magdalene, the old guardian of power, discovered that the greatest wealth was not in maintaining total control, but in allowing transformations to happen. Louise, in turn, had the confirmation that it was possible to love and be loved, reconciling the family legacy with his own choices. And Renata, until then underestimated, demonstrated that true strength does not depend on social class, but on character and persistence. Life, after all, is made of unexpected turns, and the union of those three very different hearts proved that love and respect are capable of reconciling even the most inflexible of destinies. Over time, other challenges would arise, other crises, but now they had something in common that Madalena would take with her as a lesson: the certainty that, when there is sincerity and goodwill, even the deepest wounds can heal. And it was in this atmosphere that the family, reconfigured, toasted to the future, full of hope in their eyes, remembering the words that echoed so many times. Total control is impossible, but the strength to adapt is what makes it all worth it.